Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today, where we will address your questions on the topic of carbon and agriculture. I know a lot of you attended the Evolution Ag Summit last week, and we know that we covered a lot of ground during that event and that there are a lot more questions that we can answer here today. So we wanted to provide an opportunity for folks to join us for a Q&A session with our three speakers from NDSU, really to address any of the burning questions you have about the topic or any questions that hit you as you sort of digested a busy day of content at the Evolution Ag Summit. Before we get rolling, I do want to thank NDSU Extension, the North Dakota Ethanol Council, and the Office of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency through the North Dakota Department of Commerce for helping us host this webinar. We are joined today by three presenters, familiar faces for everybody who attended the summit last week. We have all three of our presenters are from NDSU. We have Dr. Dave Ripplinger, professor and bioenergy economist, Dr. Lindsay Malone, associate professor of climate smart approaches in ag, and Dr. Miranda Meehan, associate professor and livestock environmental stewardship specialist. I do want to make a note about format for today's session. So if you've done webinars like this before, the format may be slightly different. We want to provide as much opportunity as we can for folks to have dialogue with our speakers. And so first of all, please be thinking about your questions. You can ask a question in one of two ways. You can type it into the Q&A box. And if I see that question, we'll prompt and we'll bring you up onto the screen where you can have a back and forth with our speakers. You can also simply raise your hand by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to you based on where you're at in the queue. So when we get to your question, we will give you permission to speak through the Zoom tool, and you will unmute yourself, and then you'll be live and can actually have a discussion with one of our speakers. And then just want to give a final reminder that the webinar will be recorded today. The recording is in progress. So certainly feel free to have a free-flowing discussion, but we do want to archive it for folks who couldn't join us at this time today. So with that, I'll invite Dave, Lindsay, and Miranda, each of you to just offer some introductory comments to kind of recap the summit last week, discuss things that you maybe want to clarify or gaps that we maybe had in the content, and we can start exploring some of the questions that we collected from folks after the summit and open up to Q&A to all of our participants today. So Dave, why don't we start with you?
Good. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you did make it last week for the face-to-face event. It was a very full day. A few panels and presentations. I moderated the first panel talking to folks in industry who are engaged in this space in agriculture and carbon, and then also gave a talk on pricing carbon. It's a really exciting, interesting time in agriculture. I think the biggest takeaway for the event is that this is very real and very important today. It's not something on the horizon that for producers and all of us involved in agriculture that we need to begin to engage properly with this new issue. And it's in general, the way I typically look at it, I'm somewhat of an optimist. I view this as a great opportunity for agriculture, for producers to continue to provide this broader value to society. I know with my presentation on pricing ag, it's pricing carbon in agriculture. It's really difficult to give the number that many folks want. They want to be able to calculate the dollar figure, and we're not quite there yet. The biggest thing I want for folks to take away from that is that the value probably isn't zero, although it has been for quite some time, and to be ready for the many different ways in which these carbon prices will begin to affect agriculture, which is really, really exciting. And there'll be much more clarity on that to come, which will be great because it'll allow all of us to make better decisions, to have more information about what's going on and how we should respond to these opportunities.
Thanks, Dave. Lindsay, we'll go to you next.
Sure. Yeah, it's awesome to be here. I think that I wasn't sure what to expect with the summit. Was it last week? Feels like it was simultaneously a year ago and yesterday. Um, it was fantastic. It was one of the best like rooms I've been in to have kind of that synergy around all these conversations, and it really feels like a space where we can kind of talk about the nuance with these questions. Yeah, so I am, if you didn't meet me or see me last week, I am a relatively new assistant professor at NDSU, been here for about a year and a half, and I'm focused on climate smart approaches in agriculture. Um, what that really means is, to me, is building resilience, especially on the farm scale and the field scale, thinking about preventing erosion, building organic matter, and that kind of thing. My lab is launching a survey today. I was hoping to have it for the meeting last week, but it actually worked out well. I think it would have been hard for people to actually answer it at the event. But it takes about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm really looking for input from especially producers, CCAs, and just general agricultural community members on what they think about climate smart agriculture, and some research focus areas as well. So kind of it's a research tool, but it's also something for us to use looking forward. Yeah. And Dave's involved in that as well. Yeah, that's kind of a intro comments from me, I guess.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. And that climate smart survey is in the chat for our attendees to grab that link. Miranda, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, so my approach is probably similar to Lindsay, except with the livestock component. Really just how can we build resilience in these systems? And when we do that, that's going to enhance our carbon sequestration and storage potential. And so my focus was really on, how do we put diversity into those systems, whether that is a native rangeland system and having those plant diversity, especially those native deep-rooted plants, and facilitating that, which will help with our climate resilience in those systems as well. The really big potential, I think, is in those integrated crop livestock systems and getting a return on that investment in the cover crop, and maybe some other bonus benefits too when we look in these carbon markets as well as we learn more about them. And also just kind of, there's lots of gaps in the research, especially on the grazing side. A lot of research goes grazing versus no grazing, but we don't look at that specific management of that grazing, which makes a huge difference on our carbon storage potential. Whenever I think about these kind of conversations, I think of my soil genesis class way back in the day. And the professor always said that organic matter and carbon comes from roots in the soil. And so, where our greatest potential is where we have the greatest roots in the soil. And so whenever I think about those conversations, I imagine Jimmy Richardson jumping around the classroom telling us, this is the one thing I want you to remember. And then I think one thing we didn't touch on, which I know Lindsay and I both discussed, is there's a lot of research coming out on within our types of soils and mollisols that we have a greater clay content that's going to increase our carbon sequestration potential versus other soils. And so as we strategize where we want to implement these practices on the landscape, thinking about that soil type, because soils that have better growth potential are inherently going to have higher storage potential.
Awesome. Well, thanks to you three for joining us today for the discussion. Again, our goal here today is really for all of our attendees to sort of drive the conversation. So if you have questions or comments that you want Dave, Lindsay, or Miranda to address, please drop those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or you can simply raise your hand. That button is also at the bottom of the screen, and we'll bring you on to have dialogue with our speakers. We did collect questions from the attendees the day of the event, and so I want to get started with a few of those. And Lindsay and Miranda, you both talked about, some of the gaps in the science, right? Some of the sort of continuous improvement happening with the science on these practices. And I think for a lot of farmers, this sort of creates confusion, like how much science do we have and how much science do we not have, right? Some people hear that and they say, well, then we don't even know if these practices are worth it. Other people hear it differently. And so can you sort of put that into perspective? Where are we at with the science? It seems like we have a general idea what practices are good, but maybe some of that really granular analysis is missing.
I can speak to kind of the climate smart side a little bit, and maybe my answer will muddy the water more. That we do have there is a lot of research out there, so there's a lot of data, but it depends on where it's coming from. Miranda brought up a really good point of those soil factors sort of limiting or increasing the amount of carbon that could be stored, that could be sequestered. So where that research happened matters. But there's also science is not, whenever somebody describes something as being an exact science, it feels like an oxymoron to me, because science is really a moving target, and we do have kind of evolving perspectives and things like that. Yeah, so I'm not giving you the nitty gritty answer. I think one of the other challenges that we have, especially if we're talking about, this is kind of coming from a soil health testing perspective. One of the challenges is we have soil health principles and practices, and we might say, oh, look, these are good tests because they go up. These measurements go up when we do these practices. But then we also might say, oh, these are good practices because these values go up when we do them. But that's kind of a circular logic. That doesn't necessarily mean that both things are true. So where is kind of that chicken and the egg issue? But when we're talking about building carbon, I think there's one of the big pieces is thinking about permanence. So yes, those roots in soil are going to be one of the main sources of building that soil organic matter, sequestering carbon. But that fresh organic matter, sometimes it's called particulate organic matter, is not as permanent. So that's not necessarily what we're talking about when we're talking about like long-term sequestered carbon. We're more so thinking about mineral associated organic matter. And sometimes a lot of the research that we have doesn't necessarily differentiate between those two pools. So we're looking at all of the organic matter that's there. So you might think about, you have a lot of corn residue sitting on the surface. Yeah, technically that is organic material right there, but it's not sequestered carbon. Yeah, so I think it is a little bit of a moving target. Miranda, do you have any other, I'm rambling now.
Yeah, I think building on that is, I think we're a little more secure in terms of like sampling numbers and procedures within a cropping system, but within grazing systems, it takes a lot of samples, and most of the research that has been done hasn't even collected the number of samples that's required. So there's about 10 projects that have been done properly, just because of the high variability in those systems. And so as we learn more, the research gets better always. And so we can be more secure in what we're learning and sharing that information. And as I mentioned, just the gaps in terms of looking at grazing management, where there's some studies that are coming out that are really good, and they're actually within our region, so helpful that way too. But like Lindsay said, a lot of the research hasn't been conducted in our region. A lot of has been done in the southeast, and that doesn't translate to our semi-arid environments very well.
Okay, great. I think that was really helpful and confused me a lot at the same time. So that's what I get for asking scientists a question like that. I think the bottom line, it may be just, is this a fair way to describe it or not? Like, we generally understand a practice like cover crops, a practice like, intensive rotational grazing. Those practices are good for the soil. They generally promote soil carbon sequestration, but there are a lot of questions, based on soil conditions, based on weather conditions, based on, what's growing there. There are a lot of questions about how much from scenario A to scenario B, how much that changes. Fair? I got it. Cool. Thank you.
Write
So
that down.
yeah, there you go. So Dave, I want to shift over to you. I think one of the interesting questions that comes up in this space a lot, and the Evolution Ag Summit, we intentionally have a very strong focus on what the markets are doing. And we intentionally don't bring in policymakers into that discussion because there are a variety of perspectives on the politics of this stuff, but there's also a market-based reality here. And so I would love to sort of get your take on, if we take the politics of this issue away, do you think the markets continue to drive the discussion to some extent? And when I say the politics of it, I'm really talking the capital P politics, the public policy changes, regulations, laws. Without those, does the market continue to drive it? And I guess I'll leave you with that as the question is, how much of this is public policy? How much of this is the market? And what if you take that public policy element away?
Yeah, it's a great question, and get it a lot, talk about it a lot with folks in the space. And there's differing opinion, but in general, and even if we look at other policies or just think about regulation in general, it is powerful, right? And so it does have the ability to make things happen, change behavior, and the like. If we look at what's happened in carbon markets today, looking back even 20 years with some of those early activities that were voluntary, there was demonstration and experimentation and learning, and we continue to do that. And even today, if we look at the voluntary side, so this would be, what corporations primarily are doing because they want to, they think there's value to the business to do it. It's still really quite small in dollar figures. It's very what I'll call experimental. As we look at different approaches, we talked a little bit about the contracts that farmers might have available to them. They're not fixed. We're all learning. And if we look at the future of how this is likely going to come about, the regulation is really powerful, and sometimes you have desired regulation. I talk because I do a lot of biofuel work too, and so there's a lot of folks who are thinking about and in the process of making investments in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. They're relatively hesitant to do that without some sort of policy support and something that's very clear and tangible. And a lot of these are newer projects. Before, when we saw corn ethanol and biodiesel build out, there was support, but the RFS had a somewhat light-handed approach. Now, what most project developers want, and this is on the biofuel side, but it extends to carbon, they want the rules. They want something behind it. And there's actually there's economic theory behind this where industry goes to the regulator and says, create these regulations so we all have the same rules.
Yeah.
And so then the government can be the enforcer, the regulator, but it might be industry who helps inform that. And so I really do expect over time some of these voluntary activities and all of these systems built around it to somehow be brought into legislation to be part of regulation and the tax code, because it imposes a formality that can't be avoided. And that's really what we see if we look to other places, if we look to California or to Europe, where there are still voluntary things. It really is that rule of law that is really making it real, just like it's becoming real here.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think the way you framed that was really useful. I think like the RFS is a good example of where we have regulation really there to facilitate sort of a unique marketplace. And so I think it's good to draw that distinction between there's public policy that forces markets to change, and there's public policy that facilitates that change and really acts as the referee as all of these different market actors are, changing their approach really voluntarily. So that's helpful. Great. As a reminder to everybody who is attending, you can throw out questions for Dave, Lindsay, and Miranda, either by typing them into the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, or by simply raising your hand. If I see your hand is up, I will allow you to come on and ask a question. So one of the things that heard anecdotally from a lot of people, and then we also did get some questions submitted on it, was that a lot of producers are interested in a little bit more detailed information about what this entire process looks like. Okay, I decided I'm going to access a carbon credit market. I decided I'm going to, enroll in like an ADM regenerations program or something like that. What should I expect through that process? What should I expect from the person on the other side? And I know that varies a lot, but Dave, we'll maybe start with you. And if you could just sort of walk us through the basic expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's important to understand, especially in the last year or so, we've seen the interaction between farmers and the carbon space change or grow a little bit. So there are different opportunities presented in different ways. Much of what's happening more recently is on the inset side. And so farmers might find it much easier to interact with inset markets because you might be taking your grain to the elevator and they might give you an extra nickel. The carbon offset situation, as you mentioned, Matt, there's about 10 different players in the space. They all have a different approach, different terms of their contract, different ways that they think about carbon. They're all interested in farmers adopting practices that either reduce emissions or capture and store carbon in the soil. And so that's the main driver. In terms of the interaction, a lot of what's happened to date, the more active players, so Indigo Ag was one of the bigger ones. They were at the event last year, and I believe Paul Overbeat spoke about his continued experiences with them. They've been relatively active. There's also agriculture companies that we know. And in fact, there was just a news article yesterday on Bayer's activity in the space. For each one of those, you'd have a different discussion, a different interaction, a different contract, but oftentimes those groups are out marketing, and it becomes a bit of having your ear to the ground, although they are trying to find farmers to some extent. And then once you get to that point, it becomes a bit of a conversation. I stand by my long-term recommendation to kind of do your homework first on these practices before engaging. But if we think about some of the larger ones, the Truterras, Bayer, Indigo, what they're going to have are contracts, and we visited about this earlier this week. Always, if you're looking at entering into a contract, consider talking to legal counsel. Farmers, legal attorneys are getting a little bit more experience with this, but to understand those terms of what you're promising, what they're promising, what the penalties might be, what the risks are, what you're really committing to. But for the most part, if we look at all of these 10 or so contracts, the different dimensions, you can actually screen pretty quickly. Are they active in your state? Are they active in the commodities you grow? Are they arranging things and things you might find more interesting? I do think that it's because this is such a now issue that I wouldn't say necessarily go find an offset contract, go sign that offset contract and do it. But I do think it is worthwhile to think about your entire operation and possibly a field or fields where it might be worthwhile to entertain that thought, not to fully commit, not to sign up every acre that you have, but instead to think about, which fields might work best in partnership with your CCA or whomever, and be ready to have that conversation. I think the evaluation, all of that, there's the farmer, there's the landowner who might not necessarily be the farmer, uh, the crop consultant, the attorney. We really, unfortunately, don't have a tremendous amount of shared learning in this space. And again, very much this is where we're at. It's to kind of go out there, and obviously, Paul has been out there for 15 years doing this, which is like amazing, and has his experience. But I think that some of us we have to have that experience. We have to go out and just learn by doing, which is not necessarily what folks want. They want the 4-step process and the this, and this. I will mention that NDSU Extension is working on building a tool that will help farmers evaluate different contracts and really to kind of filter to identify those that would work best. Again, looking at geography, crops, some of the terms to narrow it down. And that's helpful. But at the same time, there are those who are more active, those who are, blasting emails and, doing their active marketing. And I would be looking at those because oftentimes those are the folks who are looking to sign those contracts. Unfortunately, there's kind of there's an ebb and a flow in this if we look back even just 5 years. And it isn't necessarily uniform across the industry, but some businesses are very, very active and remain active. Some of them sometimes pull back again because what's really happening now is we're not really trying to build the system, we're trying to learn. And so they might say, gosh, this year we just want to target Iowa. And so we're going to do a blast and we're going to get folks out there, as opposed to what the long-term situation will be, where we want to find the best place wherever it is. And in many cases, that will be North Dakota.
And I think an important distinction to make, and you've made this before, Dave, is that, for especially carbon offset markets, usually they're paying you for tons of carbon that you sequester in your soil, right? And I think a lot of producers are used to more of an NRCS style delivery system, right? I'm going to do this practice and I'm going to get so much payment for practice. And I think that concept, you're signing a contract to sequester carbon in the soil, and practices might be part of that contract, but it's really to give a best guess as to what that storage potential is, which brings us back to some of the discussion that Lindsay and Miranda brought up earlier. In this carbon contract space, we talk about MRV systems, measurement, reporting, and verification systems. I think a lot of producers get nervous about, there's somebody going to be coming onto my farm and taking all these soil samples, and what do they need all this information for? And so can you talk about that a little bit? When you sign one of those contracts, what is that company really looking for, and how are they verifying that on your operation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It actually goes back to the first question of Miranda and Lindsay too. There's different approaches and there's different science or methods behind each one of these companies. And the limited science that we have, which I think is helpful, but again, there's so much more needed, i.e. continue to fund land grant-based agricultural research, because we need to do a ton in this space. But there are programs where they will pay by the practice. So it is, go no-till, right? No-till. And they'll pay you X dollars an acre, but they'll typically reserve the right to come back and measure. And those measurements, and again, this is an important distinction. You might have a contract for a year to be paid for a single year, but they may reserve the right to come back 5 or 10 years later. So really, you're making a multi-year commitment, right? Generally, they do their math in different ways. It can be, essentially a blanket for their entire year or for that given period of time. We're going to pay, $10 an acre for cover crops. Hard stop. And they almost always will reserve the opportunity to come out. Other folks very much go and they look at the soil type, they look at the region, and there's a model that USDA has. You can plug things in and say this practice should do this, and they'll use that to estimate on a more disaggregate basis exactly what should be paid. We're some time away from you sign it, just do this, and we'll pay you on the fly, or we're going to track it on the fly. That'll be probably after I retire at the age of 75. Right now it still actually is kind of practice based, but the measurement does matter. And for folks to understand that. And I do make the joke too about clawback. Nobody wants the clawback. The clawback destroys the system. If there's large amounts of clawback, the credibility of the entire industry is jeopardized. And so if you actually look at what folks like Indigo Ag do, they underestimate. They want all sorts of things. So even under the worst case scenario, when they're selling credits, they've got their bet hedged. It's like, yeah, we sold you one, but we actually have 3 over here just in case.
I can add a couple things if that's okay, Matt. So one of my favorite lines about just science in general is all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So there's always going to be a point where this modeled amount or this guessed amount is going to be wrong, but within a certain window, it's likely to be useful or accurate. And that window could be regionality. It could be that the weather behaved the way that we thought it was going to, et cetera. There's a lot of room there. I know that there's some, and I'm sure Dave knows more about this than I do. There's some trade-offs with the sort of, how precise and accurate the data is. So if you're doing more measurement to see what that, to see how much carbon is being stored, that is it's worth more, but it also costs a lot more to do that testing. Do you have comments on this, Matt? No, you're muted.
No, I just think this whole conversation is really fascinating.
Okay.
Sort of science versus the economics of it.
Well, but there's also that balance, which we have to do as scientists all the time, of figuring out, it would be great if we could I'm planning grid soil sampling in a few weeks, and it would be great if we could do quarter-acre grids, but that's not realistic. How much information is it actually going to be for us? How much time and labor is it, et cetera. But one other thing that I want to mention, I know there's some noise and frustration about needing to measure bulk density when taking these measurements. And one of the reasons that that's important, so if you've looked at soil organic carbon data before, you've probably looked at something that's a percentage, which is it's sort of a concentration of the amount of carbon that's in that soil. But that doesn't necessarily translate. So if you have a really dense soil compared to a looser, lower bulk density soil, that percentage difference is going to matter, especially in terms of depth. So in order to actually get a carbon stock, you have to have the percentage of organic carbon as well as that bulk density. So that's one of the reasons that bulk density, I know that's been a sort of point of contention with a lot of the sampling, because it is expensive and time consuming. Are you actually getting accurate information? Lots of questions there. So yeah, those are just some of my little 2 cents pieces about the measure MRV that I wanted to. I was a lot more skeptical about carbon markets overall and these carbon programs until I really read into a lot of this MRV piece. And I think it makes sense. And I think, Dave, you're right that nobody wants those clawbacks. We want this to be a good thing. Everybody, all the players in this want this to matter.
Yep. And I want to add one thing too. I use this joke a lot where, Lindsay used the example of models. I do it husbands. They're always wrong, but they're sometimes useful, right?
That's great. Yeah.
That is not science-based anything. That's just a joke.
Miranda, did
I
you have
was going
something
to
to
add
add?
just, yeah, just a
Yeah.
little bit. Like, I know both Dave, Lindsay kind of touched on this in terms of like strategizing, working with your CCA and locating places. And I would say just based off the data and research that's out there right now, that I would focus on crop ground at this point in time, just because there is some research done in Nebraska, so not similar environment as us, that show changing grazing management didn't change their soil organic carbon at all. And so I would be hesitant to focus on grazing lands at this time until we have more research.
I just realized too that I didn't finish my comment. So if you do more measurement, that might be a sort of higher value metric. But there are some programs that will accept a lower, sort of like lower assuredness. And they're more so based on models than on lots and lots of soil samples.
Yeah, and I'd add too, I mean, as economists, we work on similar issues all the time. The sampling issue. How much data do I need? How much risk can I take or can someone else take? And it's all extending into this space. And it's getting a lot of attention because the expectation is this will be a multi-billion dollar market. And in many cases, there isn't like an official right answer. It's, what will the buyer accept, or what will the critic not overly criticize?
Yeah. So I mean, I just think this conversation is so interesting because it's really complicated, right? It's a really complicated answer. But I also ask myself sometimes, like, how, for just the average person, you guys please keep making it complicated because that's what you do for us. But um, for like the average person, how much it really matters. And so I'm just going to sort of throw this out and ask you guys to react to it. But to Dave's point, there is, you're going to have a contract with a company. They're going to buy certain tons of carbon sequestered, or pay for ecosystem services if it's a little broader. Um, and so they're going to make an estimate, right? One way or the other, they're making an estimate of what that is. And then they're selling those tons to another customer. And they want that customer, if it's Delta Airlines, to have confidence that the number of tons of carbon sequestration they're buying is actually accurate. Um, but there's sort of a trade-off. We can't have these companies coming out to test every acre of ground, right? And so in my view, some of this will just sort of be solved by the marketplace in terms of how granular, how specific our expectations are. And right now we sort of have all these companies coming in with different systems, but I think the market will sort of require a shakeout that, gets us to maybe not the exact same system, but systems that are pretty parallel, pretty even, and pretty consistent, and balance that economic trade-off of, testing versus estimating.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, right? And we've seen this already. If we think more broadly about offsets, a lot of the initial activity was in forestry, and we've essentially tapped that market out globally, for the most part. But a lot of those offsets that were created really weren't credible, and when that happens, it damages the system as a whole. Definitely hurts the forestry folks, definitely hurts all of those parties who were involved, be it the buyer, the broker, the project developer. And I think we're going to see some of that in agriculture, because some of these offsets are much easier to defend than others. I don't think we'll have the wholesale crisis that forestry's had. I think in general, we will see, as Matt points out, this kind of convergence. I don't think there's going to necessarily be a single winner or a single system, but there will be some sort of like rationality, because right now it is just a very young market. And so you have all of these different players trying all of these different things. And again, it's important to note nobody is like fully into this. Delta is not buying as many offsets as they're going to buy in 30 years.
Mhm.
And so a lot of what we think is real market behavior is just the test of the week.
Right. So we do have a question in the chat from Christy Jagger. Christy, I am going to allow you to talk. So you'll be able to come on live and you can ask your question yourself. You may have to take yourself off mute when I allow you to talk. So Christy, you should be, there you go.
I didn't really want to be on video, so I
That's
wasn't
just fine.
prepared for that. Great. Yeah, I just was curious to all of you, if you were a farmer and rancher right now, and I'm working hard to absorb all this information, but would you act on anything? Would you do anything right now, like 2024 or 2025? You kind of answered it, Dave, when you said they're maybe not actively looking yet, but I mean, do we seek out companies? Do we go to a place, or do we wait till policy is in place?
Yeah, so I think it depends. What a poor answer. And also too, if I didn't have to show video, I wouldn't either, but it's kind of required. So I think there's a couple of things. One, and I kind of mentioned before, now is the time to become familiar. Within the next couple of years, you're going to get hit by this if you like it or not, just because you're involved in agriculture. I think that, and again, those who are participating today, I would say, have a larger amount of interest in this than the average producer. I would encourage all of you to continue your education in this. And I mentioned earlier, I would encourage all of you to think about these practices specifically, and we can do cover crops, we can do alternative tillage, we can do changes in nutrient management, possibly talk to your crop consultant. And again, this is my long-standing way of framing this. If you sit down and you're talking with your crop consultant and you crunch the numbers, like, gosh, at least on this field, I should really try. I should try cover crops for a season or two, or I should, a lot of my neighbors are doing, are using this alternative tillage. You know what? I'm going to give it a shot. If you're thinking about doing that, then I would absolutely actively seek out these folks, because some of this ends up being water under the bridge. Some of the contracts do allow you to go back. But we're going to reach a point too where, time's going to pass, and I think most farmers are probably going to forego some revenue because they take their time. But I would use this as a chance to learn. And my full expectation within a generation, this is all going to be quite common. And there's certain advantages to being what we call a first mover. There's some costs, but to just, to get out there. And again, too, I would start thinking about you and your operation. Paul also had some great thoughts too about how it fits philosophically. Like, what is this farming thing all about? What is my operation all about? What am I all about? To fit it within the business broadly, get some additional information, and then go out and, if things are looking interesting or very interesting, actively seek out an opportunity, and then have to go through the contract evaluation process. And again, too, there's a cost to learning, and you don't necessarily have to make money on a field doing this, right? I'm not saying incur tremendous costs, but there's value in that. It's not a market benefit, but it's a true benefit. You will learn a lot going through this. And that could end up being very, very valuable in coming years.
Yeah, Dave hit on almost everything I was going to say. The only thing I would add is a lot of my research focuses on the benefits of some of these practices outside of getting paid to sequester carbon. And I think kind of reflecting on what practices are going to make sense for your farm and figuring out what you do want to do. And then from there saying, okay, yeah, we're going to adopt no-till, but hey, this is a great time to get paid to do so, or kind of get that extra. And that was one of the things that Paul kind of mentioned, is that he wanted to use practices anyway. And this was a kind of a bonus. So
Yeah, I'd echo what Lindsay said in terms of like, even when I work with people on grazing systems, what are things you're gonna do, what works for you, and then how can we get an extra return on those things that we're already gonna do.
Christy, was that helpful? Do you have any follow-up questions?
I don't think I do. That was very helpful. I think that is, I'm putting my mindset, not necessarily mine, but what farmers and ranchers might think is, well, maybe I should just wait to do this until I get paid and then I won't get paid. So that'd be the only thing I would have to add in just thinking of where farmers' minds might be.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. The problem, as an economist, it's like market timing. It's, we don't know for sure. And again, I don't know what the price of carbon is for any given farmer, and I don't know what's going to be in 5 years. And so instead of waiting for the perfect time, if things align, I would encourage folks to consider it, if not, adopt some of these practices, get engaged. And we're talking a lot about offsets, but there is all of this. But if I'm gonna get it right, so climate smart commodity partnerships work, right? Which is not necessarily, it's not offsets, but it's other ways in which all of agriculture is engaging with production ag to address climate. Look at those. I mean, I wouldn't wait until everything is perfect, because things are never perfect.
So I have I'm going to add 2 points. I guess I'm the moderator, but I'm here. I'm going to throw a couple of things out. I think the first thing that the first point I want to make is nobody else except for that individual farmer can answer how a given contract might align with that farm's goals or that ranch's goals. And so I think that, to Dave's point, sometimes engaging with that company, whether you sign the contract or not, will help you better understand your goals and how a given contract might align with them. And we can provide all the education in the world. And until you actually have a contract in front of you, a practice selected, acres to do it on, there are going to be questions that we can't answer, that nobody can answer, because it's a personal decision, right? It's based on your goals for your operation. I think the other thing is there's a question about risk there, right? The price could go up. Dave, you said that price could go up. The price could go down. It could be locked into, they're looking for that permanence, right? So locked into, they can come and test you anytime in the next 10 years, whatever. And I think one of the sort of ideas, and Dave, I think you might have talked about this at the summit a little bit too, is maybe don't start with a 10-year contract, but if you can find somebody who will, who's offering a 1-year contract, a 2-year contract, it might be a good place to start. It's going to lower some of that long-term risk for you, and maybe give you an opportunity to explore the system a little bit. So thanks for indulging me. Miranda, I want to circle back, as building off of Christy's question. I want to circle back to a comment you made earlier, which is it might not yet be time for folks with grazing systems to really jump in. And, I've always understood that's not a knock at the sequestration potential of grazing lands. It's that they're already doing it and have for so long. But just want you to talk about that a little bit, and then I might have a follow-up question for you.
Perfect. Yeah, there's just not enough research for one, but as I think those of you that were at the summit, I mean, the graphic, 80% of our grasses biomass is in roots. And so we're definitely sequestering, and overall, it's pretty stable form if they're managed properly. And so it's just that because they're already sequestering at such a high place, even poorly managed ones sequester pretty well compared to some of our cropping systems. And so where's our highest potential? Where is maybe a more guaranteed return? And I think that cropping system are probably that place right now, especially until the research catches up in our region on grassland systems. I'm not saying that it's not ever gonna play out for you, especially as we see some of these invasive grasses in our area. I think there is potential there. There's not enough data to support those decisions. I don't feel like right at this time.
And one thing I'd add, I'm very excited about grazing and integrated livestock to address this carbon issue. There's a need for more science, and the livestock side is behind crop science, as we've talked about. The one thing that you can do, in this space possibly is you can put together large projects really quick because the practices are more continuous. They don't change. I don't have to worry about what the crop is going to be next year. And in terms of the volume and the area, it to me is as exciting as the crop side. It just hasn't gotten much attention yet, but it's coming. And in all of this, these systems are so complex that we're going to know more in 10 years, 30 years, but we're not going to know anywhere near everything. And so I I would actively watch that space, and I know it's part of the discussion in livestock generally, but it to me is very, very exciting.
So I am going to throw in a follow-up question there. So, obviously when we talk about soil carbon sequestration, I mean, that's really, the answer to that question is really focused on that, right? On the soil carbon sequestration from a grazing system. But in the livestock space, there are a lot of existing opportunities for livestock feeding systems, right? For feedlots, hog barns, dairy facilities. Um, and anaerobic digesters are part of that. I mean, some of that is ready to go, right? Some of that is already happening. And so, Miranda, I'll just throw that back to you. And Dave, some of that ties into bioenergy as well. So I'll let you, the two of you tag team that, and then Lindsay, you can jump in too. Sorry.
Yeah, so I am not a ruminant nutritionist, gonna put that out there, grazing person. So yeah, there's been a lot of research in feeding systems to make those more efficient and to reduce emissions from those systems. And we continue to do that research. So I do think that that is definitely something that we're addressing within the research space. And there's potential there for adapting changes and using, increasing our feed efficiency. So that's kind of what I've got on. That's pretty vague. I'd have to connect you with somebody else in the department to answer that in greater depth.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. So I actually do give a talk semi-regularly on uh, beef, cattle, and carbon because it's really interesting. I think there's so many dimensions to this, but I think one thing that I'd like to share with cattle producers is that I mentioned this regularly, I mentioned it last week, by becoming more efficient, you're reducing emissions. And one of the things we've seen in terms of cattle is feed use efficiency, more meat to the consumer per animal. And so emissions in that space on a per kilogram basis of beef is ever declining. And that's really, really exciting, interesting, and something that cattle producers should know. Um, Matt touched on it briefly, and it is very interesting. So one opportunity in this space is the collection of manure, the digestion of manure, and the production of what's called renewable natural gas. It's methane produced with organic material. Uh, the impacts of that on emissions from a systems approach are tremendous, and the returns to implementing a system like that on an operation are off the charts. And I don't have slides with me, but I have slides that I share pretty regularly about the economics and just to understand the magnitude. So we buy natural gas, the physical in a unit called a decatherm or an MMBTU. It's about $2.50. The value of the carbon credits right now associated with that same unit is over 40. So if you are able to collect manure, which not many systems in North Dakota are made to collect manure in a condition where it's ready to be thrown in a digester. But again, you would produce that physical unit, get $2.50 from the market, and get $40 from a California carbon credit. And billions of dollars have flowed into agriculture. The folks who have systems like that, dairies, confined hog operations, and the like. And there's a large feedlot project in Nebraska who's looking to leverage that too. If anybody's thinking about revisiting livestock in their operation, that's something to consider.
I just have a tiny comment to add. Well, it's not a tiny comment. I think one of the reasons I liked that you emphasized, Matt, that this isn't a knock against animal ag and grazing systems at all. I think one of the reasons that it's not that the science is necessarily behind, it's just more complicated. I know I was part of a study. We were looking at soil health tests in soybean systems, but a colleague of mine, fellow grad student, was looking at grazing systems. And she was trying to look at different management practices that were impacting the soil organic carbon, basically. But the biggest factor that was coming out in her data set was how long it had been a pasture. Some of them had never been disturbed. They maybe had really poor management, but they had high organic carbon because they weren't plowed up. So that's just another factor to keep in mind, that when we do have almost a more closed system. I'm imagining my parents' dairy farm and their giant manure pits that they know how many gallons are in there. Whereas when you have animals out, like what's behind Miranda right now, it is just there's more unknowns that we can't measure everything the same way that we can in a simpler operation.
Well, great. So we have 3 minutes left. I don't think we have time to jump into another question, but want to thank Dave, Lindsay, and Miranda. Appreciate you carving out some extra time to come and answer questions after the event. I want to thank everybody on the call for attending this conversation, for attending the Evolution Ag Summit last week, and for those of you who attended the pre-webinar. Really appreciate your engagement with this topic. I am certain that there's going to be a lot of additional work and education on this topic. Farmers Union is committed to providing the best resources we can. And I know that NDSU continues to do that. And I would guess this won't be the last time we collaborate on the topic. So want to close with that, and do want to thank again NDSU Extension, the North Dakota Ethanol Council, and the Office of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency through the North Dakota Department of Commerce for helping us host this webinar today. Thank you, everybody.